Obrigado pela vossa paciência e atenção. O orador convidado para a última intervenção é Geoff Mulgan. Ele é o diretor executivo do Nesta desde junho de 2011. Para quem não sabe o que é o Nesta, recomendo uma breve passagem pelo site na internet, que é muito mais elucidativa do que qualquer coisa que eu possa dizer, mas como pequena introdução e enquadramento, diria que o Nesta é uma organização britânica, começou como um organismo público, neste momento não é, e procurando resposta a uma inquietação que, imagine-se, também é britânica. O Reino Unido não conseguia capitalizar devidamente o talento criativo que emergia no país. E também reconhecia que havia dificuldade em transformar ideias inovadoras e inventivas em produtos de mercado, que conseguissem chegar a todas as pessoas. E, portanto, o Nesta surgiu desta ideia e desta necessidade de valorizar, ajudar a produzir ideias, boas ideias, que pudessem chegar ao mercado. E é uma espécie de incubadora de boas ideias, com uma lógica muito internacionalista hoje em dia. Geoff Mulgan, o nosso orador, tem experiência no assunto. Nos 7 anos anteriores, antes de ser diretor executivo do Nesta, ele foi o primeiro diretor executivo da Young Foundation, que se tornou um centro de referência na inovação social. E antes disso, de 97 a 2004, teve várias posições governamentais, incluindo a de diretor do Government's Strategy Unit e diretor de políticas públicas do gabinete do primeiro-ministro britânico entre 1997 e 2004. Deixo-vos, portanto, com Geoff Mulgan, antes do encerramento da nossa conferência de hoje. Thank you, Geoff. Welcome.
Well, good evening, and thank you to the Foundation for inviting me here. Thank you for your stamina. You are still here. If you would like to use this moment to stand up and wave your hands around, please do so, because it is quite late, and this may make it easier for you to hear what I am about to say. You will all have seen Hollywood movies, and you know what the 3-act structure of a Hollywood movie is, yeah? Act 1 shows the family in the suburbs living a happy life. Act 2, a disaster happens. A meteorite comes from the ground. Criminals take over your house. And then towards the end of Act 3, the hero saves the world. This is now the end of Act 3. I am not going to save the world. But what I will do is talk a bit about how science may be part of saving the world, and how science may change to become part of the solutions of our era. And I'm going to talk a little bit, if this works, about brains. You all have brains, I guess. You probably have quite big brains. And probably the most important decisions, or some of the most important decisions you make in your lives, are where you direct your brains to. There's an extraordinary quote from the former head of data at Facebook not long ago, where he said it was a tragedy that the best brains of his generation were focused on encouraging people to click through to advertisements. And I think there is a question where we direct our brains to individually and collectively. The other reason I've put that picture up there, I don't know if you can guess, there is strong scientific evidence that if you put a picture of a brain in your presentation, the audience is more likely to believe you. About 25% more likely. So I can get away with anything now. What I'm going to talk about is really a paradox which I see of our times. We are awash with intelligent tools. You have them in your pockets now. Some of you are probably looking at them. We have, sensors. We have supercomputers like Watson. In London, where I live, we have Google DeepMind, extraordinary learning technologies, and computing power beyond anyone's imagination of a generation ago. And yet, on so many of the issues we face, the world doesn't always seem much cleverer. We have at this very moment, COP21 meeting in Paris to think about climate change. We have the IPCC, which is the global structure for organizing the science of climate to help the world make the right decisions. I was one of the people who a few years ago was in the last attempt at this in Copenhagen. I don't know if any of you remember what happened in Copenhagen when the world's leaders came together to solve climate change. And it was a disaster. It was a complete chaos. The papers on the floor there, the meetings with Obama and others completely failing to make headway, to make any progress, was in a way a symbol of collective stupidity rather than collective intelligence. I hope COP21 will be better. But I think this is the paradox we all face. Unprecedented brain power, but not necessarily unprecedented ability to solve our biggest problems. So what I'm going to talk about is just three things. I'm going to talk about the re-energizing of three great traditions in science, the traditions of seeing, of making, and testing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bad traditions, and then I'm going to try and say how we pull together some of these elements to create new models of collective intelligence, which make us more than the sum of our parts. So you can leave now. This is all I'm going to say. Let me start with the traditions. Science is in many ways about seeing things in new ways. A few weeks ago in London, there was an exhibition of this man, Robert Hooke, who was one of the first inventors of the microscope. And he was able to show these microscopic organisms. These are fungi in a mushroom. That is a flea. He could show in a drop of water from the river that it looked like clear water but was full of life. And this is an extraordinary thing science does. And the physicist Richard Feynman had a wonderful saying, how often you need to see things to understand them. You have to see how they interact before you can mentally work out the model, the hypotheses which drive science. And science sees the very small and also sees the very big. I don't know if any of you recognize this from a few weeks ago, when some scientists claimed they had observed around a star, a very long way from Earth, signs of extraterrestrial civilization. That there appeared to have been superstructures created around this star, which showed a civilization of extraordinary intelligence, far beyond our capability. That lasted about 3 weeks, and then it turned out it was a mistake. I was half disappointed and half relieved, because extraterrestrials who were quite so intelligent might just have come and enslaved us rather quickly. But this is again science seeing in new ways and opening up possibilities. And then sort of in between the very small and the very big, I'm very involved at the moment in the open data movement, which is using data in cities and societies in new ways. And this is an example I like from New York. New York's fire service used to go and put fires out. But then their data scientists said, let's try and see if we can predict where the fires will happen. And they put together lots of different data sets on buildings, on their age, their quality, their conditions, and in the end developed an algorithm with 60 variables, which turns out to be pretty good at predicting where the fires will come. So more of the fire service now goes to stopping fires, helping people improve their buildings, rather than putting the fires out. And this is a map, the sort of map which is seeing a city in a completely different way. Seeing a city through the lens of which buildings might burn down. Hopefully not this one, which looks very solid. So there's science as seeing is a long tradition, but I'd say being reinvented in all sorts of ways. The second tradition I want to mention is science as making, as doing things often with your hands. Leonardo da Vinci was obviously a great designer and drawer and artist, but also a fiddler. He played with things. He played with wood and metal to get a feel of what would work. And in the opening lecture this morning, Professor Calado mentioned this book by Walter Isaacson, The Innovators. I don't know how many people here have read this book. It is a fantastic book describing the lives of the creators of the digital world, from Ada Lovelace to Alan Turing to Steve Jobs, Gordon Moore. And what's interesting is they are exactly like the people who made the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. That revolution was made not so much by scientists in the academy, but by what Ernst Mockir, the great historian of the Industrial Revolution, called tinkerers, people who fiddled with things, tried different kinds of machine or mill, and through that tinkering and the culture of tinkering created a new industrial era. And the same was true of the digital people. A remarkable proportion of them had parents who were radio hams, who in their shed or their attic would in the evenings fiddle with electronics. And the children saw their parents doing this, and this gave them a way of looking at the world as something to be made, fiddled with, tinkered with. And this is often, I think, an underexplored side of science, and yet a really important one. You learn by doing, you learn by making. And one of the great movements at the moment around the world, which my organization has been very active on in the UK, is getting children from 6 or 7 years old onwards making digital things, making websites, making games, making robots, making apps, using things like the Raspberry Pi, the computer you can buy for $20, to have that experience of making, which I think will be crucial to their ability to shape the world around them. So that's two traditions. The third one is science as experiment. The very radical idea that you learn through error. You learn things by trying things, making mistakes, learning from your mistakes. And that in the experiment, you have a control group. And you learn by the difference between your intervention group and your control. Absolutely obvious to everyone in this room, but very, very radical in its implications and unknown through most of human history. To me, what's most interesting now is how that idea of experiment is spreading to very different fields. Here is a very different field, scared straight. Have any of you heard of Scared Straight? So this was a program in America which got former criminals, usually people of 25 or 28 who had been in gangs, had been drug dealers, murderers, and it would send them into schools to talk to children and scare the children off becoming criminals. And this is obviously a really good idea. And American foundations have spent hundreds of millions spreading this idea. It has its own TV series, as you can see. It's still on TV. But what some of these people don't know is that a group of scientists used the experimental method with a control group to discover how effective this method was. Can you guess what they discovered? This is what they discovered. If you expose children to Scared Straight, they are more likely to become criminals. Now, there's a very interesting sort of psychological debate about why this is, which there's not time to go into. But the important point here, this is applying the essential experimental method of science to fields like education or criminal justice, from which they have been absent, and generating counterintuitive, surprising findings. So that's, to my mind, a great tradition, finding new energy and new purpose. What are the bad traditions? Well, I come from a country where a few hundred years ago our king, King Edward, actually passed a law against those that doeth innovate. You could be imprisoned if you were an innovator. Innovation was a bad thing, a heresy. And we are, to an extraordinary degree, surrounded by powerful, visceral, anti-science movements. Creationism has already been mentioned. The belief in intelligent design, climate change denial, not to mention, of course, ISIL. And I would not have guessed 10, 20, 30 years ago how strong anti-science would be, and how a high proportion of the candidates in the US presidential election are, at their heart, anti-science, not pro-science. And I love this quote from John Cage, the composer, who said, "I don't understand why people are scared of new ideas. I'm scared of the old ones." And all of those anti-science people are the holders on to old ideas, which are bad old ideas. Some old ideas are very good ones. They are holding on to the bad ones. Another tradition, which I think is not as gone as Kenneth Pruitt said in the previous session, the university is the ivory tower, science as the ivory tower. Universities are in an extraordinary phase of growth and expansion and investment. The world has 150 million students at the moment, but not many of them are actually working on solving the problems of their societies, their communities, their environment, their city. And I think what has mainly spread around the world is a version of the university as, to a degree, an ivory tower with walls around it, not embedded in its society. And then the third tradition is science in service to power. This is obviously a great tradition. It was often governments and the military who funded science back throughout history, and it's certainly true today. Probably the most influential figure in 20th century science was Vannevar Bush, the man on the left, who built up the US science system during and after the Second World War, and was a great visionary in many ways. But he sold the huge expansion of the science system as service to power, and in particular to the military, to help the US in the Cold War, to such an extent that only about 5 years later, President Eisenhower warned that the America had a military-industrial complex which even a president couldn't contain. That's science locked into power. And if you look around the world, and you look at where public money goes on research and development and science, about half of it goes to military R&D. In my country, in France, in Russia, in China, in the US. This is the priority for where we put our money, perhaps not in Portugal, into science, is into better ways of killing people, better ways of surveillance, not into things which we can benefit from in daily life. And this is one of the reasons why I think some people are often hostile, skeptical about what science means, because they see it serving not them, but serving power, serving big government, big military, big business. So that's three healthy traditions and three not so healthy traditions. What I want to turn to is some new hybrids, some ways in which I think science is evolving in ways which are genuinely useful and make the most of the good traditions and hopefully avoid the bad sides of the bad traditions. First of all, I want to talk about science in service to the wider economy. There was a kind of model of science policy which was very dominant in the 20th century, in the age of Vannevar Bush and others, which was focused on these great centers of knowledge production. This is German pharmaceuticals at the top, and in the bottom is Bell Labs, probably the most creative, successful center of scientific work in the 20th century. And a lot of science policy was really about how would you pump money into these sort of places, and then out of them would come a flow of basic science, which would turn into technologies and into companies, and that would in turn make your economy grow. That is still a very popular metaphor for the role of science, even though the academics debunked it quite a long time ago. Most of the big expansion of R&D spending around the world is still going into this quite traditional linear model. But at the same time, you can see everywhere in the world very different ideas of how science and R&D can serve the economy. All of these different types of innovation. So user-driven innovation in fields like sports, service innovation, things like airlines, open source innovation. Most of the technologies of the internet do not have property rights in a classic way, in the way that the left-hand side assumed. Maker spaces are spreading everywhere. I just met my team yesterday who've been in China, mapping the maker spaces across China. Extraordinary array of places encouraging people to make furniture, technology, machines. We have design-led innovation. Apple never spent very much on R&D, and indeed Apple has created very few genuine breakthroughs in technology, but they have been very good at recombining other people's ideas in an effective way. There's the social innovation of Muhammad Yunus and thousands of institutions around the world, and all the moves towards much more open innovation methods, which I'll say a little bit about later. This is a different view of how science serves and feeds into the economy, which complement the old one, but are very different in feel, very different in culture, much more open. The one other thing I wanted to mention in response to the discussion earlier today on the economics of science is some very interesting research which will be published next year in the US, and which precisely echoes the messages of Walter Isaacson's book. And this was research looking at the relationship between, really, who creates patents, which people in America invent the new technologies. And a group of absolutely top-rate economists looked at the links between patents, education, and parental input. And they found a very, very strong link. They found that the adults who invent new technologies and drive growth invariably had a strong input either at school or from their parents, which gave them experience of science, gave them experience of invention and making and creating. And what these economists recommend, or will recommend, is actually shifting science policy and innovation policy away from tax breaks for venture capital and so on, and putting much more of that money into giving children experience of scientific invention from an early age. We are doing parallel research in the UK. We will test out this thesis, but I think it has quite radical implications for how a country should think about science policy, and it's very different from, I think, some of the things which are normally part of that debate. Perhaps even more important than that, though, is the question of how science serves society. Now, if you go to science policy discussions in Europe or North America, you find quite small groups shaping the discussion. It's a dialogue between the scientists, the ministers, the big businesses, and so on. It's very rare to ask the public what they think science should be for, even though it's their money which is funding the science. So last year, we did some survey work in the UK, trying to get under the skin of what the public really thought were the priorities for science and innovation. And the prompt for us was probably quite similar to what might be needed here in Portugal. We were in a time of austerity, public spending being cut, and we thought there was a good case for increasing spending on science, R&D, innovation. But we were worried that the ways in which the arguments were being made by the scientists and the politicians weren't the right arguments, weren't the ones which resonated with the public. I'll summarize what's quite a complicated story, but here's the first part of it. We asked the public what were their priorities, which fields should get the most public support. And perhaps not surprisingly, healthcare came up completely top. Feels like energy, agriculture, education. Although, as I said, half of our spending went on the military only came down at number 7. And we analyzed these by age, by political background, and so on. So we found a big mismatch between what the state thought the priorities were and what the people thought the priorities were. We also found, when we broke down the population, that there was a large minority, perhaps a fifth of the public, who were very pro-science, very pro-innovation, who would support almost anything you did in the name of novelty. And most of the people shaping the debate, and probably most people in this room, might be part of that 20%. I was. But there are much larger groups out there who are a bit skeptical. They're not anti-science. They know we need innovation to solve problems of climate change or health, but they wanted ethical questions attended to. And these were some of the concerns they had. They were worried, about technology destroying jobs and leaving no jobs for young people. We found in our research on the UK, about a third of all jobs are likely to be destroyed by automation in the next 20 years. They were worried about children spending all their time looking at computer screens and losing social skills, not being able to deal with human beings. They were worried about throwing things away too often. Each year's new iPad means you chuck the other ones away, and so on. And these were actually, we thought, pretty good questions. These were more intelligent questions to ask of science and innovation policy, but they weren't being mentioned by the scientists or the ministers who were always talking about global competitiveness, the drive for novelty, why we need more science. And so we made recommendations about how you would reshape the political arguments around science to attend to the priorities of the public who wanted to see benefits in their own life, in terms of things like healthcare, and who wanted a discourse of science which attended to questions of ethics and so on. I think this democratic view of science can be made practical, and I want to tell a little story which goes back 300 years. 300 years ago, the British Parliament announced a prize for anyone who could find a way of determining the longitude of a ship at sea. In that period, in 1714, many ships crashed into continents or islands because they didn't know where they were. It was a big problem in an age of early globalization. And so they announced a £20,000 prize, which was a lot of money then, and opened it up to anyone to win. And in the end, the winner was this man, John Harrison, who was not an eminent scientist, not an astronomer, not at Oxford or Cambridge. He was a clockmaker in Yorkshire. And yet his solution proved to be more effective through objective measurement than the solutions of the grand astronomers and professors and so on. And this method of open innovation, meritocratic innovation, we think is a really important one. And so a year ago, we reinvented the Longitude Committee, which had last met in 1814, and we announced a new Longitude Prize, but this time we opened it up to the British public to vote on what the priority should be. And we gave them 6 choices: carbon-free flight, water desalination, paralysis, dementia, food and antibiotics. We worked with the BBC, who ran TV programs, radio programs, discussions in schools, satire programs which made fun of it. We worked with Amazon, who emailed all of their customers in the UK, and we got hundreds of thousands of people to vote on this. And in the end, they voted for this as the priority: the threat of antibiotic resistance, the threat that hundreds of millions of people could die in the next few decades because new diseases grow up which can resist antibiotics. And this is now live as a global prize for anyone who can prove they have a solution not dependent on the status of their university or their company or where they are from. And this is one small experiment in democratizing both the setting of science priorities and opening up and democratizing the task of finding solutions. Now, this is part of, I think, a much broader sort of transformation in how science is being done. And I want to share a few other examples. Polymaths were mentioned earlier. Have any of you seen the Polymath blog? So this is a blog put up by a mathematician in Cambridge where he posts difficult maths problems which no one has solved, but instead of sitting in his garden trying to solve them on his own, he opens up to a community of mathematicians to share solutions, a collective intelligence approach to maths, and has been very successful at solving problems more efficiently than lone individuals in the traditional academic way. This is another example. This is Kaggle in software. Kaggle, based in Australia and California, posts algorithm problems, data problems, and opens up to any scientist or any programmer in the world to prove they can solve the problem. One of their very first winners was a teenager in Mongolia who turned out to have better solutions than anyone else, and they pay them for coming up with solutions. So it's a method of doing science just like the original Longitude Prize, but almost opposite to the way our top universities run. Opposite to the way most R&D money is allocated, where it's allocated to the grand, the old, the top of the hierarchy, not to people who necessarily have the best solutions. Here's another example, Zooniverse, one of the many experiments underway now in citizen science, involving hundreds of thousands of people in collaborating to map the stars in astronomy, or to look at cancer diagnosis in health and many other fields. And these are all, in a way, trying to turn science from something separate from society, which has a dialogue with society, into science as part of society, a co-creation, co-owned, co-made, and focused on the things society cares about. Incidentally, how many of you have taken part in Zooniverse? A handful of hands, okay. And I think we're moving towards, slowly, a quite different paradigm of how science can be done. And I want to mention, this is an example which we're launching this month in the UK through my organization, Desta. So this is called Dementia Citizens. Dementia is a scourge of every society in the world. There's probably, well, in Britain, there's about 1.5 million people with dementia. Huge sums of money have been spent on research to cure dementia, with almost no effect at all. Science has failed so far on dementia, and yet people need solutions. So we're attempting a very different approach, where we will recruit hundreds of thousands of people with dementia and their carers. We will give them, first of all, apps on phones, and then wearable technologies, and will then run real-time experiments. So our aim is that we might take 10,000 people and encourage them to try a certain kind of music playing for 3 weeks, or a new diet, or dancing. And we'll then compare how well they are doing, how their bodily functions are, their mental well-being, against a control group. So we'll be applying the scientific method, but to research embedded in society. And then, of course, that group of people with dementia will become a collective, will start having a voice, and start trying to influence service providers and the health service to serve them better. It's the beginning of what I think is a very different way of organizing healthcare and health knowledge, combining the best of science, the best of technology, with people taking control over their own condition. There are many other examples in very different fields. This one is about floods in Jakarta, where PETA Jakarta takes data from citizens. They generate the data showing where floods are spreading across the city to help the city respond much more quickly when there is a flood. And there are similar things like this. Ushahidi, you may have heard of, which does this in disasters, using, again, citizen generation of data and solutions to complement the professionals, the scientists, and the governments. Patients Like Me has been going quite a few years, which is another very similar one, which brings together patients with conditions like multiple sclerosis in this case. They share knowledge with other patients. They run real-time experiments on themselves, and there's now, I think it's 250,000 users, 2,000 conditions, and their research is published now in scientific peer-reviewed journals. Again, it's citizen-generated scientific knowledge, and the knowledge is applied almost immediately by the users. And it's a final example from Spain is Smart Citizen. This came from Barcelona and has mobilized a network of people all over the world to use simple devices to measure environmental data, quality of air, and to create a living map of pollution and air quality from China to Canada to Sao Paulo in Brazil. An extraordinary project, very, very simple, but in countries like China, generating much more reliable data than the government, which couldn't be believed in terms of its data on air quality. All of these projects are still, in some ways, quite small, quite modest, but I think they point to a very different way of answering the relationship between science and society. I just want to make two more points before I shut up and you go off into the night. The first really builds on the scared straight example I used. I think this is an era when the scientific method, the basic idea that you test things out, you use control groups, and you act on knowledge and you use errors, should become mainstream for almost everything that is done. And one of the things I've been working on in the last few years in the UK is helping to build a new family of institutions which try to do that. The first of these is called the Alliance for Useful Evidence. And this tries to bring together all the organizations creating evidence in things like school teaching, or healthcare, or policing, or economic strategies for towns. And we bring them together to learn about how to use data, when to use randomized controlled trials, how to interpret the evidence. We run sessions at political party conferences. We have ministers as sponsors, and we've tried to embed awareness of evidence into our culture. We have newspaper columnists in major newspapers who comment on the evidence of public policies, criticize governments if they introduce policies for which there is no evidence. And we've been quite successful, we think, in shifting our culture so the scientific method is everyday, is normal. We've also persuaded the government to create a series of What Works centres. We now have 9 of these, and their job is to help the practitioners in different fields get access to the best of the world's knowledge about what works. So are any of you teachers? If you're a teacher or the head teacher, there is now an organization and a website which will tell you the effectiveness of different things you can do in the classroom, how much they cost, how strong the evidence is, how much they contribute to advancing a pupil, how many weeks or months compared to other things. This is incredibly useful, and yet it didn't exist before. The same is being done for the police, who used to use no evidence at all. You know, their job is to collect evidence, but they didn't use evidence on policing. We have it for healthcare, a very strong organization now, which rules on the cost effectiveness of every new drug, every new treatment. Does it work? How well does it work? And we've just started a new What Works Centre on happiness. What makes people happy? On which there is a surprising amount of evidence, but almost none of it used, almost none of it embedded in the daily life of workplaces or communities. And I think this is an enormously important movement which hasn't yet really had influence across Europe or across the world. And to my mind, it's obvious, if you are a teacher or a police officer or a nurse, you should have easy access to the best of the world's knowledge. That is the principle of science, and yet we lack institutions to make that easy. And a stage on from that, you get to what we've called the health knowledge commons, which we're trying to develop at the moment. And the idea here is that through your smartphone, you should be able to access immediately the very best of the world's knowledge about health to guide you in a diagnosis if you have symptoms, to help you interpret what you should be doing with your diet or your fitness or your lifestyle, and to turn the world's health knowledge into an easily accessible commons. And we're doing this in a way in competition with the hundreds of thousands of apps there are out there, which do offer health apps, but often with no evidence at all. Or to counter the problem of Google, that you type in your symptoms into Google and you're as likely to get a dramatically misleading response as one which actually will be grounded in knowledge, science, and evidence. So this is a kind of movement, and this is the really boring slide, my last really, really boring slide, which sort of sums up one of the things we've tried doing. We've tried to have a common language to describe standards of evidence, to describe how well you know something you do. And this is very, very simple, and yet I think quite radical. And we've worked with government and big businesses and charities and foundations to get them to accept this. So whenever you're doing something, or funding something, or proposing a policy, you have to say, which level is it? Level 1, you just have a good account of why your thing might work, why your new teaching method, your new policy for parking. Level 2, you actually have some data which shows that what you want to do does actually work. Level 3, you have a control group. You've actually tested your intervention out like Scared Straight and seen if it makes things better than a control group. And level 4, you've replicated that. This is a very simple idea. The vast majority of things governments do don't even get to level 1. The majority of things in education and in universities barely make it to level 1, if I'm honest. And businesses often sell products with no evidence that they work. To its credit, the world's biggest education company, Pearson, is now using this internally for their own educational products. And even if they start off only on level 1, they try and ensure they have a way of moving them up. And we persuaded our government to do the same. When it funds projects, it provides a bit of additional money so the project can gather more data, can use a control group, can find out if it really works. And I would really urge anyone who has power in this room, in a government, in a business, in a foundation, even if you don't use this, use something like this. Because we need this sort of application of the basic scientific method, if only to save money, and not to waste millions and millions on things which don't work, in the way that in the US, the foundations continued funding Scared Straight, even when it was clear it wasn't working and was doing more harm than good. So what I hope I've sort of talked about are some possible answers to how the world might use its brains, and even your brains. And I think the future of science and society is, of course, a complicated story. In some fields, we have ever more depth in science. The amazing example of the journal article with 5,000 authors we heard about this morning. We have many fields of science where science just takes much longer than in the past, much bigger teams, more international teams. You get a Nobel Prize much older now than you did 30 years ago, for any of you waiting for a Nobel Prize. So some aspects of science are becoming deeper and longer and slower and more complex. But at the same time, we've got these other movements which are, I think, embedding science into society, making it part of daily life. So if you wear a Fitbit, you think of yourself as a living research experiment. If you're part of something like Smart Citizens, you're collecting air quality with thousands of other people around the world, and you're part of science. If you're one of the patients in something like Dementia Citizens, you're not observing science being done over there. It is integral to your life, and you are using its insights very, very quickly to help you. And I think the more we get science embedded in society like that, the more our publics will ask of science policy that it directs its priorities to the things which matter to us, which deliver a tangible benefit to our lives, to things like better health, or better food, or new ideas for learning, and perhaps slightly less spending on drones, which can kill and maim. Though, of course, this week there may be quite a big push for even more money on drones, of course. And I think that's going to be the great issue of our times, is shifting the way in which we think about science. And my very final point really goes back to the thing about making and tinkering. If the research I told you about from America is right, if the single most important thing any society can do is to raise a generation comfortable with the idea of making, tinkering, inventing, creating, that has huge implications for how we organize our schools, how we organize our communities, how we really break open the science curriculum. So it's not just STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, and it's not even just STEAM, where you add the arts into that. In a way, we have to turn all of that on its head, so it's not just teaching being done to pupils, but it's actually pupils from a very early age experiencing the making and the shaping of the world they are within. And that, to me, is the most exciting strand of what's happening in education, when science education isn't just about fantastic programs and TVs and so on. It is about 6 or 7-year-old children getting the sense of power which comes from them using something like Scratch, making games, making robots, and seeing the world around them, the digital world, as something they can shape, they can make, they have agency over. And at a time when all over Europe, tens of millions of young people feel fatalistic, feel they don't have power, they don't have a route into jobs, they don't have really a route into the future, I think this is hugely important. And that's the sense in which perhaps at the end of Act 3, that version of science maybe does come to the rescue and, in the end, save the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Estamos a chegar ao encerramento. Antes de uma emissão especial do único governo em funções neste momento no país, como já vos disse, é o Governo Sombra. Estão convidados, e renovo aqui o convite, a utilizar o adereço que encontram na contracapa do programa deste encontro. Começámos o dia com 3 perguntas. A ciência é para todos? Como é que a ciência pode dar mais prosperidade? E será a ciência uma boa política? Acrescentámos muito mais a estas perguntas e respostas. Que ideias surgiram aqui que possam pelo menos indicar o caminho de algumas respostas? Do lado da TVI é com renovado orgulho que nos associamos a mais um grande encontro da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, é o quinto, que fazemos em conjunto porque acreditamos que as boas ideias são para levar em frente, ou dizendo de outra maneira, nunca se deve desistir de uma boa ideia. Para o encerramento, chamo-me ao palco e dou a palavra ao Nuno Garopa, Presidente da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Muito obrigado.
Minhas senhoras, meus senhores, este ano de 2015 a Fundação foi ao Encontro do Futuro. Fomos ao Porto em junho com o compromisso de pensar no admirável mundo novo e viemos agora hoje aqui a Braga com a aposta na ciência em 3 atos. Para nós, na Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, o dia de hoje, evidentemente, é um momento muito importante. Tivemos aqui um grande encontro em Braga. Foi a escolha certa para uma grande reflexão sobre a ciência e o nosso futuro comum, em sociedade e na revolução tecnológica que todos vamos vivendo e antecipando. A forma calorosa e empenhada com que a cidade de Braga nos recebeu é a prova cabal de que fizemos a escolha acertada. Evidentemente, muitos contribuíram para o sucesso do nosso encontro e cabe-me a mim aqui agradecer, começando pelos nossos parceiros e, antes de mais, a Câmara Municipal de Braga, na pessoa do Presidente Ricardo Rio, que desde o primeiro momento aderiu com entusiasmo ao nosso projeto. Destaque também o Ricardo Gomes, responsável pela comunicação da Câmara Municipal de Braga, que nos apoiou nesta caminhada. Depois a Universidade do Minho, na pessoa do seu reitor António Cunha, dos vice-reitores Rui Vieira de Castro e José Mendes, que com compromisso mobilizaram os estudantes que aqui tivemos hoje numa participação jovem muito ativa. Uma palavra de franco agradecimento pela parceria e pelo apoio da TVI. Este ano e agora em Braga, mas também desde 2012, em todos os nossos encontros nacionais. Na pessoa do Sérgio Figueiredo, diretor de Informação, do Luís Salvador, realizador e diretor de Informação adjunto, e da Maria da Paz, a produtora. E, claro, uma palavra muito especial e muito sentida para o Zé Alberto Carvalho, que nos tem acompanhado nestes 4 anos, nesta nossa aventura de promover o debate e a reflexão sobre os temas que interessam aos portugueses, reflexão séria e profunda que vamos levando pelo país fora. Uma palavra também, evidentemente, para o Teatro Circo, a toda a equipa, com uma menção especial para o seu imenso empenho e uma referência, evidentemente, aos 100 anos do teatro. A nossa jovem fundação, com apenas 6 anos, veio aqui ao encontro de uma instituição centenária de referência nacional. Gostava também de agradecer o apoio de todos aqueles que ajudaram neste encontro. O Jerónimo Martins, o Pingo Doce, a Carclass, a Olá, e na divulgação do encontro, a Invest Braga, Startup Braga, a Rádio Universitária do Minho, o Jornal Académico e os Transportes Urbanos de Braga. A todos o nosso muito obrigado, sem eles não teria sido possível a realização deste evento. Cumprimos aquilo que é a nossa tarefa prioritária e primordial da Fundação: convidar os portugueses a pensar, a debater e a projetar o nosso futuro livremente. Existimos para cumprir uma missão muito clara: informar factos, promover ideias e fomentar o debate público. E aqui estamos para isso, para ser livre e ter opinião. Saúdo e agradeço a presença de todos vós, convidados, oradores, moderadores, todos aqueles que se quiseram associar ao nosso encontro e todos aqueles que seguiram o nosso encontro pelo streaming à distância. Gostava também de ter uma palavra para o nosso fundador, Alexandre Soares Santos, presidente do Conselho de Curadores da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, infelizmente ausente do nosso encontro por motivos de força maior. Foi ele e a sua visão estratégica e a sua preocupação com o futuro dos portugueses que levou à gênese da nossa Fundação. Uma palavra especial para o diretor científico e comissário do encontro, Pedro Magalhães, assim como a comissão científica que o acompanhou no planeamento científico dos encontros de 2015, desde o primeiro momento, Ana Lehmann, o Gonçalo Almeida Ribeiro e o José Pena do Amaral. Também à comissão executiva do encontro, pois sem eles não teria sido possível estar aqui. Comissão essa dirigida pelo David Lopes, administrador e diretor-geral da Fundação, acompanhado pela Teresa Mourão Ferreira e todos aqueles na Fundação que muito trabalharam para que o encontro aqui estivesse hoje. E uma palavra também, evidentemente, à PITS, com quem trabalhámos na realização deste encontro, nomeadamente o Manuel Jorge Roque e a Joana Branquinho Lobo. A eles devemos, evidentemente, a excelente logística de que todos beneficiámos no encontro de hoje. Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, este é o quinto encontro da Fundação. Depois do ciclo presente no futuro, onde pensámos sobre a população, a Europa, a liberdade, este ano, 2015, fomos ao encontro do futuro com o admirável Mundo Novo no Porto e viemos a Braga falar da ciência em 3 atos. É verdade que vivemos um momento muito complicado a nível nacional e a nível global. Estamos todos, como sempre, e bem, ocupados com a nossa realidade conjuntural, com a nossa crise institucional e política, que se agravou no último mês, com a nossa estagnação económica e os problemas daí decorrentes, que é verdade que já não são meramente conjunturais, porque já lá vão 15 anos, com as notícias que nos chegaram dos atentados de Paris, com a falta de resposta da Europa às nossas ansiedades. Mas ainda que presos da conjuntura, é a nossa obrigação pensar no nosso futuro. E essa é a missão da nossa Fundação, mobilizar os portugueses para que o futuro não nos passe ao lado, mobilizar os portugueses para pensar no nosso futuro para além da conjuntura e dos problemas do curto prazo que nos afetam. Pode até parecer que não temos tempo para pensar sobre essas mudanças que a ciência nos traz cada dia e sobre as quais discutimos hoje. Pode parecer que não temos tempo para refletir sobre as implicações da ciência ao serviço do progresso e do nosso bem-estar e que nos desafiam todos os dias. Adiamos sempre para amanhã a reflexão sobre as mudanças económicas, sociais e políticas que são inevitáveis. Mas é para isso que viemos a Braga, dizer que esse futuro não só nos preocupa, como nos deve preocupar, porque esse futuro chega cada dia. E nós temos, enquanto Fundação, a obrigação de alertar e ajudar os portugueses a ultrapassar os problemas da nossa própria compreensão do dia-a-dia e refletir sobre esse futuro que estamos a viver e vamos viver. Os encontros do Porto, em junho e hoje em Braga, abrem com chave de ouro um ciclo fora de Lisboa, porque pretendemos, neste mandato, na Fundação, trazer a Fundação ao país que não vive em Lisboa. Assumimos neste mandato compromissos com o debate público e com a sociedade portuguesa, que é no fundo o papel da Fundação, e que passam por continuar a ir ao encontro do Portugal que queremos conhecer e dar a conhecer e que não está em Lisboa. Também queremos continuar a trabalhar particularmente com os mais jovens e, por isso, muito gostamos de ver este teatro cheio de juventude, porque é a juventude que é o nosso futuro, é a juventude que é o futuro do nosso país, é na juventude que temos a acreditar para que possamos, enquanto Fundação e enquanto sociedade portuguesa, cumprir o nosso papel. Quanto aos encontros, no próximo ano voltaremos em Lisboa para o 6º encontro. E este 6º encontro podemos anunciar que será para falar de democracia. Porque queremos falar de democracia, vamos pensar a democracia com os portugueses, achamos que é importante o desafio para 2016, uma reflexão sobre o valor da nossa democracia. E fica por isso a data já antecipada para as vossas agendas, o dia 7 de outubro de 2016, o 6º encontro da Fundação em Lisboa sobre o valor da democracia. A todos, muito obrigado e peço-vos agora que se juntem a nós para, em direto, assistir ao Governo de Sombra, que começará exatamente às 7. Muito obrigado.